If we're going to talk about the golden age of comics, it gets complicated because a lot of how we look at that era is through the lens of history, meaning we have certain interpretations of it based on what we know today. That's one of the problems with history is that it's very easy to revise it. It's very easy to insert things because we want to be right. We want to be able to say, "Aha! See, we learned from this, and this clearly was what people were thinking." But history is often more binary than that. I'm going to take a look at, and this is again one of those topics that probably deserves several hours worth of videos, and many others have. But I'm going to give a little bit of a unique perspective on the golden age and then the transition into, basically Fredric Wertham and kind of everything that went down there as a primer. Hey everybody, this is Perch. One of the things that I think is really important to note, and this is a case of setting some basic facts, some basic platform things correct, is a lot of people talk about the 80s and the 90s being kind of this huge moment where comics were making tons of money and everything was wonderful and lots of cash flows. But there was actually a far more profitable time for comic books as an industry. And that time was the golden age. If you look back at the 40s, comic books were making, so we've heard different numbers, but everything from 70 to 90 million, depending on how you count, and that's not adjusted for inflation. That's annual revenue for the comic industry. That's a huge amount. So as a basic just way to put this in perspective, if in 1948 you took $72 million, which is what comic books were producing annually, and you adjusted for inflation, for today, we're talking about $776 million a year based off of comics. And that, keep in mind, these are comics that are being sold for like a nickel or in some cases less. This was a big industry. And so, the world of comics was very powerful. And this is without graphic novels. This is without kind of all the other spin-off of revenue that it's making today. These were comics. So one thing that happened, and this is again as kind of trying to lay the groundwork for what went down. Everyone was consuming comics. TV was not really a thing. You had certainly young people and you had adults. And during the 40s, there was this suspicion of people who, kids basically reading or doing the same thing as adults. There's this I'm trying to explain this, like this psychological barrier that if kids were doing adult things, then those things must be wrong or bad. And because adults read a lot of comics and there was a market for it, as you can imagine, there was a number of different types of comics. There were comics, if you want to think about kind of diversity in terms of different stories, you had all kinds of things going on with different races, different nationalities. You had romance comics and Western comics, and you had a bit of everything during this time period. Now, certainly some point out, and they do it all the time, in 2020, there are different kind of sexual and gender topics that didn't exist in the 40s, and that is true, but they didn't exist in the 40s either as a topic. People weren't talking about these things. So it's like, there are some things that are modern that have come about with topics that did not exist in the 40s. Taking that away for a moment, though, you had a much wider spread of diversity of types of content during the Golden Age. I think most would agree with that. And you had some of the characters we know today. You had Batman and Superman, you had Captain America and Wonder Woman, and then you had a ton of other crazy things all over the place. And in a lot of ways, comics were violent. You would see blood, you would see people getting murdered. You'd see that stuff in comics. It is what's interesting, by the way, just as an aside, there was a comic called All Negro Comics, published in 1947, and it was produced by Black writers and Black artists. It featured Black characters, and there were mysteries, and there were all kinds of things going on. What's funny about that is this particular comic is often used today to showcase racism in the Golden Age, because people didn't bother to look and note that the comic was actually, the creators involved were Black, and And anyway, were there racist topics inside the book? I mean, maybe, probably, I guess, but it's important to just note that little detail that a lot of people seem to forget about the golden age. They just kind of go to Schuster and Kirby, and they're like, that's the face of everybody who was making comics during that time. I mention that because in comes Fredric Wertham, and that's again a whole topic in and of itself. But this guy is a psychiatrist. He's an author, and more importantly, if you looked into his history, he was somebody who was looking to make a name for himself. He was somebody who wanted to. I mean, I guess in today's in today's kind of concept, he'd be your it's gonna be a terrible analogy that people are gonna hate me for, but it's like a Jordan Peterson who wants to sell books, wants to go on a speaking circuit, wants to make some money. And again, nothing wrong with that. I think Fredric Wertham had ambitions beyond kind of the basic intellectual kind of academy. He wanted to make money, he wanted to have power, he wanted to prestige, and he found a way to do that, and that was go after comics. Now, why go after comics? Well, because the kids are reading the same thing the adults were. There was not a lot of elegance between which comics maybe you sell to kids and which comics sell to adults. So it was just kind of all one big soup. And so kids wound up with some comics that had a lot of horror elements or violence or romance, and that was kind of amplified by EC Comics by William Games, who really kind of popularized them. And when I say popularized, it wasn't like he went out and said, "Let me put the grossest thing possible on the page." Instead, he said, "Let's here's an example of he was able to popularize through both the art and the story and everything else horror and crime stories, and those became popular, and they were gruesome, and that was probably a lot of the appeal. You had like the concept of a jump scare in a comic book. So as these comic books are being read by kids, in comes Fredric Wertham, who says, "Oh my God, this is the biggest threat possible facing us in the world." And he went really into, and this will sound very familiar to people who lived through kind of the 80s and Tipper Gore and kind of some of the music stuff. It was this is polluting the minds of our children. Because our children are reading these comic books and they're turning evil, and this is going to subvert them into violence and everything else. And so he got some, he was able to play the fear card. This stuff is bad, therefore, this is we've got to stop it, and your kids are in danger. And oh my God, you gotta be freaked out. The people who are against us are enemies. What's funny is that he frequently made the argument that the people who were against him were Nazis. Now, obviously, the country had just come out of World War II, so Nazis was used a little bit. But it's interesting to hear a lot of the stuff that Fredric Wertham kind of went on about is you hear a lot of it today in different forms. Just saying. But he also he had a way of looking at comics and then jumping to conclusions, which a lot of people do today as well on all kind of ideologies. It was, hey, I saw this one comic where Wonder Woman was touching another woman's arm, therefore she must be a lesbian. Hey, Batman and Robin are sleeping in the same bed, they must be gay. And that became part of his arsenal. This idea that one piece of art could jump to conclusions, and off it went. So he made a lot of noise. He burned comic books. He got parents all crazy. He was he was angry about it. And it just so happened that this kind of overlapped with a different problem that comic books have, and that was that a number of comic distributors had ties with the mob. Now, I guess I should say it a different way. A number of distributors had ties to the mob. And so if you can imagine, people are wanting to crack down on the mob. In the late 40s and 50s, particularly in the 50s, there was, problems with organized crime, and our government was having a bit of a problem getting people to care, getting people to really get involved in it. There was a lot of money that actually funded movies and television shows and other things where it's like, you got to go after the mob. If you see some of these movies from the 50s that are mob movies, if you look down in the credits or, you research this, you may find that some of this film was funded by the US government because they were trying to get people to, really pay attention to the fact that the mob was a problem. So anyway, this stuff all goes down. The two sides find each other. Fredric Wertham finds a number of senators who really wanted to go after the mob and wanted to use this, they're harming our children, as another wedge to do it. Biggest name there, a guy named Kerry Calver, who was a Democratic senator from Tennessee, and he was really after the mob, and they've got to do this. So the two of them, he kind of teams up with Wertham, and they do a bunch of Senate hearings and everything else. And Wertham, who is a showman, again, that's why I think he knows how to kind of get an audience and get people all engaged. He drops the quote in the 50s of, quote, "I hate to say it, Senator, but I think Hitler was a beginner compared to the comic book industry. They got children much younger. They teach them race hatred at the age of 4 before they can read." What's curious about that was that we're talking about race hatred and some of these elements, and then a lot of what followed became, I mean, in many cases, very kind of racist guidelines. It was like, we can't have comics creating race hatred, so therefore let's not put any prominent black people in comics. It's like the what? It was like the biggest head spinning kind of, we're going to solve this by doing the exact opposite. And again, I see a lot of parallels to today and some of the things that we're fighting here, where somebody's like, we have to protect the children, and the best way to do that is to kill them all. I'm exaggerating, but there's some very weird leaps to judgment, and definitely you got this kind of mob mentality going on with Wertham and with this kind of whole time. And then that gets into the comic code, and that's a different video, and we can go on and on and on. And I've skipped over, people who are listening close who are historians and really looked at this will note that I've skipped over like 5,000 things in all this. But it was an interesting time, and I bring this up as a kind of a basic platform to say, number one, the golden age was hugely profitable at the time for comics. Number two, comic books were read by kids and adults. They were read by everybody. Comic books were just this pervasive entertainment. And then number three, why did Wertham come in and kind of do what he did? Well, part of it was out of self-interest, of course. Well, a lot of it was out of self-interest, just kind of wanting to make himself bigger. But the reason why he was able to pick up some traction is because he successfully played off of kind of fear tactics to get people freaked out. And then that was able to combine with a senator who wanted to use this "they're harming our children" approach as a way to kind of go at the mob. And these were the kind of the different pieces in place that all, transformed into comics. And I think the final bit of all this is it set in motion people in the late 50s and early 60s who knew how to kind of play by the rules and basically kind of be able to map to these guidelines, but in a way that they could still push popularity. I think Stan Lee, you could argue, was very clever in figuring out how he could work under this system successfully, and other people at Marvel and everything else. But anyway, it's a lot of interesting piece. Kaufner, of course, never went anywhere. He went somewhere. I mean, he was the running mate for Stevenson's campaign in '56, and since you didn't hear of the Stevenson Kaufner ticket, that didn't go anywhere. But anyway, it was interesting how it all went. A lot of publishers went out of business, and it definitely sent things in a radically different direction for quite a while. But you may have some questions on this, or do you want to hear more? Do you want me to dive more? Because like I said, this could be hours and hours worth of videos talking about everything that went on here and the craziness of this time. But let me know if you're interested in having me dive into that part of comic history. I'm happy to. Again, these aren't the biggest hit generators, but they're fun to do for me anyway. So let me know what you'd like. Like, subscribe, click the bell for notifications. If you're one of those insane people that downvotes everything, make sure you don't listen to this point before you downvote, because you're just wasting your time. But I will point out, when you click on it and you downvote, you're effectively giving me money. So if you all want to subscribe, if you want to get a bunch of your friends to subscribe and downvote things, I don't really care. I'm way above the threshold for where YouTube is going to start, saying, "What the hell? Why don't you have more people liking your videos?" So you're entertaining yourselves. So I hope you're getting some entertainment out of it. I don't know. I'm just getting your money. So thanks. Anyway, have a good day. Thanks for listening.